On October 25, 1854, over 600 British cavalrymen rode straight into a trap they had no chance of surviving. They weren't defeated because they lacked courage. They weren't weak. They were sent there by men who simply couldn't communicate with each other. That morning in Crimea, during the Battle of Balaclava, one of history's most shocking military disasters unfolded. The British, French, and Ottoman forces were fighting the Russian Empire for control of the region. But what happened that day wasn't a story of victory. It was a story of how poor communication, massive egos, and personal rivalries sent hundreds of soldiers into a deadly situation that never needed to happen. The situation was tense from the very beginning. The British commander, Lord Raglan, was watching the battlefield from a high hill known as Sapune Heights. From his position, he could see everything happening in the valleys below. He noticed Russian troops attempting to remove British cannons that had been captured earlier from Turkish positions. In the military culture of the 19th century, losing your cannons to the enemy was a huge disgrace. Raglan didn't want that stain on the army's reputation. He quickly wrote a short order on a piece of paper. He wanted his cavalry to move fast and stop the Russians from taking those guns away. This is where the communication fell apart. From his hilltop position, Raglan had a full view of the battlefield, but down in the valley, the cavalry commanders could not see what he saw. Captain Lewis Nolan, a talented but very impatient officer, delivered the written order to Lord Lucan, the head of the cavalry. Lucan read the note and was immediately confused. The note told him to advance rapidly and stop the enemy from carrying away the guns. But from where he stood, he couldn't see any Russians removing artillery. He looked around and asked, "Which guns are we talking about? What exactly is the objective?" Nearly a mile and a half away stood the main Russian force. Dozens of heavy cannons were positioned at the end of that valley, with thousands of soldiers waiting behind them. Nolan said, "There is your enemy, and there are the guns." It was a disastrous misunderstanding. Nolan indicated the wrong target, and Lucan believed he had been ordered to attack the entire Russian army head-on. To make matters worse, the cavalry leaders actually despised one another. Lord Lucan and Lord Cardigan, the commander of the Light Brigade, were brothers-in-law who hadn't spoken in years because of a personal feud. This hostility meant that no one wanted to ask questions or work together. Cardigan received the order to charge straight down the valley. He studied the terrain and instantly recognized the danger. Russian riflemen were on both hillsides, and a row of cannons faced him from the front. It was a trap in plain sight, often called the Valley of Death. Cardigan knew it was a suicide mission, but in the military culture of that time, obedience was everything. Challenging the order would look like cowardice. So he drew his sword and gave the signal to advance. Around 670 cavalrymen began riding into the open valley. They started at a steady pace, then moved to a trot, and finally at a full gallop. They had no cover, no backup, and no real strategy other than riding forward into the smoke. Then the Russians opened fire. Shells burst overhead and slammed into the ground. Rifle fire poured in from both sides of the valley. Men and horses fell constantly. The air filled with gray smoke, the smell of gunpowder, and the screams of the wounded. Yet the Light Brigade maintained their formation and kept moving. It was an extraordinary display of discipline, but it was being wasted on a catastrophic decision made by men sitting safely on a hill. Against all odds, some of the riders actually reached the Russian cannons. They fought with their swords and briefly pushed the enemy back. But they were completely alone. There was no infantry support and no reinforcements to hold the ground. They had no choice but to turn around and ride back through the same deadly crossfire. The return was even more brutal. When the survivors finally reached British lines, the valley was covered in the bodies of their friends and horses. In just 20 minutes, nearly half the unit had been killed, wounded, or captured. A French general watching from a distance said, "It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness." The soldiers of the Light Brigade displayed remarkable courage. They followed their orders without hesitation and rode into certain death. But courage was not the problem. Pride, rivalry, and a total failure to communicate destroyed them. History remembers their bravery, but the tragedy remains a warning that one unclear order can lead to a fatal decision. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's darkest strategic failures, make sure to subscribe to History's Fatal Decisions. We have more stories of empires, errors, commercial disasters, and the human cost of bad leadership coming soon.